you not?
Good beings. It's like Christmas morning.
Come gather round this riverside campfire. There's stories to be told. I'm Nick Turner, and this is Jopre's Whitewater, a celebration of whitewater kayaking and the legends who've shaped the sport.
Brought to you by Kayak Session Magazine, the international whitewater magazine. This magazine is a true work of art. If you've never picked one up before, go to the local shop, find one, and look through, and you will be amazed at what the sport is doing right now. If you want to find out what the latest expeditions are going on all around the world, it's in Kayak Session Magazine in the news section. If you want to find out in-depth articles on the latest exploits of the very best paddlers in the world, it's in Kayak Session Magazine. The artwork, the photography is on another level from anything you've ever seen. The founder of Kayak Session Magazine, Toon, Philippe, anyone who's been in the industry very long knows him well and knows that nobody is more true to the sport. So if you want to support the sport, see what all the latest people are doing, and get the very best eye candy available on earth in the sport of whitewater kayaking, then do yourself a favor, go to kayaksession.com and pony up some of those dollars, drink a few less PBRs, and get yourself a subscription. Your buddies will bring beer over to come read the magazine at your house. Kayak Session Magazine, the international whitewater magazine.
Today, incredibly pleased to have with me Corran Addison, a guy who's probably brought more innovation to whitewater kayaking than any other individual, and at the same time, probably brought more controversy to whitewater kayaking than any individual, because maybe one metaphor is when Corran showed up, whitewater kayaking was a nature-loving hippie girl, and Corran wanted to take her to the rave, and the only way to do that was kicking and screaming and dragging her by the hair. But so many innovations that are standard in whitewater today, things like hard edges, planing holes, so many of it, short boats, has Corran was really at the forefront of bringing that in. So true pleasure to have you here, Corran. And where'd you grow up? How'd you get into kayaking?
I grew up in South Africa. I'm originally from South Africa, and got into kayaking sort of sideways. My dad saw Deliverance and wanted to learn to whitewater canoe. Couldn't find anything about canoes or canoe molds, but I think the university had like this old kayak mold from the 60s lying around. And he was a lecturer at the university and managed to convince a handful of his students to go on this crazy expedition with him. And they built these boats in the university basement. And I was there the whole time. I was like 5 years old, and I'm watching this whole thing go down, right? And saw them go on this trip. And my mother was the shuttle bunny, and we were in the back, my brothers and I, in the back of the car. And I just remember thinking, I don't want to be in the car. I want to be out there with them. And so although that trip there was an utter failure, they came back swearing they would never ever do it again. And then a few months later, they were building new boats, and I was like, "Can I be part of this?" And that's how it started, about 1975 or something.
All right, so you guys were building the boats and then going out and just exploring new rivers around South Africa.
Yeah, I mean it's a weird thing for us that's really unique because I never learned to kayak on its own. Because when we wanted to go kayaking, first we had to invent and build the equipment, and then we could go. So for me, designing paddling equipment is the same thing as paddling. They're inseparable. Because for the first 10 years of my paddling, you couldn't buy any gear. I mean, we're talking about the most basic stuff. And when I say I was designing, I mean my dad, my mom, his friends, but I was there, right? Watching all this go down, and for what it's worth, throwing in my 2 cents. But, the boats are filling up with water. What do? Let's put a cover over the cockpit. Well, how do we do that? So they reinvented the spray skirt, and we're paddling into the wind, and it sucks because the top paddle's always in the wind. What do we do? Oh well, let's put feather on it. Um, we're moving around in the boat. This really sucks. Well, how about a seat? Let's put seats in these things. But then I'm still sliding forward into the boat. Well, let's put footrests in it. Like none of this existed. Like it's you go to a store now, you say, "Hey, I want to learn to kayak," and you go take a class, and all this stuff is there, but none of it was there. We didn't know how to paddle forwards. We didn't know how to turn. We didn't know how to read a river. We didn't know what an upstream, downstream, eddy, wave train, rock, hole. None of that. We knew none of that stuff. We didn't know about seats. We didn't know about footrests. We didn't know about backbands. We didn't know about flotation. We didn't know about cockpit rims or spray skirts or helmets. We invented, 20 years after the rest of the world had, we invented all of this stuff. So it was all part of paddling.
Wow. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. Now that's amazing that it just so little outside influence that you had that you just created it from kind of like the Russians did with rafting.
Yeah, it's the same kind of thing, right? When you're completely detached from Western society, Europe and America, right? I mean, we had this book, or my dad had this book. He had this black and white book from like the mid 60s that talked about some very basic stuff, how to build a boat out of fiberglass, and it gave some really basic ideas of how to do it and how to make a mold. And so they were wood stripping a plug and then making a mold, and some very basic ideas about what waves were. But I mean, this thing was from the 1960s, right? So it was very basic at best. Maybe a half dozen hand drawn images in this book, like not even any photos, right? And then all just text. Um, I think the cover had a photo, if I remember correctly. I mean, it's a long time ago, right? But um, and so it was interesting because we had to reinvent kayaking independently from what had already been done. We didn't come up with anything new. We just did it independently.
And so did you guys really start to explore further and further throughout Africa when you were kind of still in your teens?
Yeah, well, I mean, by the time I was 10 years old, we again, I'm along for the ride, right? So when I say we, it's really my dad and his friends, right? And I'm just sort of there. Um, but we were exploring rivers out into the Kalahari deserts in Namibia, on the South African and Namibian border. They did some trips in Lesotho when they went all the way up to the source of the Orange River up in the Lesotho Mountains. And most of these trips were um, somewhere between success and failure, right? Because not everybody would make it all the way down the river. So you have people hiking out of these canyons or out of these mountain ranges. They maybe don't make it all the way down before they have to pull off the river. So it's like this, success was relative, right? Like nobody died. So is that a success? Um, or they got down enough of the river to have the knowledge to be able to go back, you know, kind of thing. But it was all in South Africa and Lesotho. We weren't yet exploring, into Zimbabwe and the Zambezi. That all came much later in the mid to late '80s. Um, but we went pretty far and wide, yeah.
Yeah, so kind of the river campfire lore is that then maybe, I don't know, 15, 16 years old or something, you wrote a letter to Bill Masters of Perception telling him how he can design kayaks better, and that brought you to the US?
Yeah, I don't think it was quite that confrontational, maybe. But yeah, um, so again, if you go back to one of the first things I was saying, which is for me, paddling and designing were always the same thing. There was never a difference between. It wasn't like I paddle and I'm like, oh, I wonder if you could do this, or I wonder what it would take to become a designer, or that that process never happened. In order to paddle, you had to design. In order to paddle, you had to build. It was the only way to do it, right? So, in 1983 I think in 1983, we went. So by then we'd kind of connected with some of the clubs in South Africa, and we realized that like we weren't alone. That there were people in South Africa who were kayaking. They called it canoeing, like they do in England. But by canoe they mean a double, a kayak. And so there were these clubs, and the racing scene was very big. There were a lot of people doing these marathon races on whitewater rivers with these 17-foot super skinny sprint boats, but in whitewater rivers, right? And we connected with some of these clubs and got networked in with them a little bit. And so our progression happened a lot faster as we bumped into other people, including meeting the 1981 world silver medalist Jerome Corran, who was a South African who'd been living in the UK and had gone to the World Championships for downriver racing. And he was back in South Africa, and my dad did a trip with him. And he had this plastic boat, the Perception Quest. And it was short and highly rockered with blunt ends. I mean, that's pretty funny that was our perception of the boat. I mean, this thing was 4 meters long with super pointy ends and no rocker. But compared to what we were in, that's what it looked like. But it was plastic and you couldn't break it. And at one of these club meetings, this guy had this Perception catalog. And he goes, look at these boats. They're in plastic, and there's this boat called the Mirage, and it's an improvement on the Quest. It's like a new, more rocker, blunter ends, better, higher performance boat. And I'm thinking of bringing 6 in. And I'm going to have one for myself, and I'm going to pre-sell 5. Who wants one? And my dad said, we'll take 2 for me and him, right? And so we prepaid these boats in South African Rand, which is useless currency. So it cost my dad a fortune to get these things. And then 6 months goes by, and these boats show up, and we were bitterly disappointed because it wasn't the Mirage. They put this other ridiculously stupid boat in this mold, in this container, the Dancer. It was super short and super rocket, and we were like, how are you supposed to paddle this thing? It's way too short, and it's way too rocket, and the ends are way too blunt, and we were all like irritated and upset, and the guy's like, I don't know, man, they're looking at the letter, they say, no, this is the improvement on the Mirage, and it's a better boat, and we didn't want to send you Mirages when this boat had just come out, so we sent you these, and you can't have your money back. And we were like, oh. And it turned out it was a great boat, the Dancer. Right? I mean, it was phenomenal boat. So at the end of the day, we were super happy, right? But the joy lasted about a year. And then I'm like, this could be better. It could have more rocker. It could be shorter. It could have blunter ends. It could have a bigger cockpit. It could have a flatter hull. And so I started doing these drawings. And then the drawings went to me doing a wood strip and making a mold and making a boat. And the boat was amazing. It was called the Aquabat, is what I called it. And the boat was truly amazing. And I was like, Perception should make this thing in plastic. And I sent them a letter. And I was like, I've got this new boat, this new design. I want to show it to you. I think it would be a nice addition to your line of boats. What do you say? And they were like, come on over. Show it to us. Like, it's on your dollar, but come on over. So I bought a ticket, backpack, girlfriend in tow, took a plane, landed in the airport in Greenville, South Carolina, and was like, called Perception, like, hey, I'm at the airport, come get me. And they were like, and you're who? I'm like, I sent you guys a letter. I actually sent it to Joe Pulliam. Joe Pulliam is the one who got the letter. And so they sent somebody to pick me up at the airport, and they brought me in, and they looked at the boat, and timing is everything. Timing is everything. If I'd showed up with that boat 3 months earlier, Perception would have had no interest in me or the boat. And it just so happened that this really weird dude called Vladimir Vaha had just done this boat called the AQ. the Air Aquatic, and it was short and it was wide and it had a flat bottom. It didn't have rocker and it had pointy ends, but it was short, wide with a flat bottom, with a little bit bigger cockpit than the Dancer had. And all of Bill's paddling friends from the 1970s that he grew up paddling with and that they paddled together and they'd always paddled his boats, every single one of them sold their Dancers and bought an AQ because it was more stable and easier to turn. And Bill was like, we need a boat like this. And at a quick glance, my boat looked like that. It was short and it was wide. It had more rocker. It had, because I was trying to creak in it, right? But he looked at this and he went, wow, this is the boat that I need to get my friends back. That was kind of his motivation. Is it was a personal insult to him that his longtime friends had abandoned him, right? I mean, we're talking like 5 people, right? And that boat became the Corsica. So that was the first boat. So he just offered me a job right there. We sat down, we looked at this thing, we marketing department, and then right there and there, he offered me a job. And I was just hoping that he was going to build my boat. And now all of a sudden, we're applying for work permits.
That was a great design, that Corsica. Right? I mean, the Dancer's kind of the godfather of all plastic kayaks, but that Corsica was, yeah, that was a big step ahead compared to what was out there. Corsica S.
It was a compromise because Bill was he wanted a boat that was gonna make it easy for his friends to paddle the Nantahala and the Ocoee and not flip. So I convinced him to do a big keyhole cockpit. It's easier to get in and out of. Your friend, you're getting old. Your knees are not bending the way they used to. It's bigger cockpit, but I wanted it for safety, right, for creaking. I convinced him to put a little bit more rocker in the boat because I said it'll be easier when you're surfing, that the nose isn't going to dive. Like with the AQ, the nose has a tendency to dive, and it's not going to do that, and it's going to be easy to handle. But there were things that he wanted in the boat, for example, that he wanted the ends to still be pointy because to him it didn't look right to have these blunt ends on the boat. It looked wrong, So the ends of the boat were pointier than what I would have wanted, and I didn't get to put as much rocker in the boat as what I wanted. I didn't get to make it quite as short as what I wanted. So from my boat that I had, it actually got a little bit longer. And that's how the ends got a little bit pointier because we just lengthened it a little bit because it was too short. But then who ended up buying the boat? People all of a sudden discovered creek boating. All of a sudden you could go creeking and not die. And creek boating took off. And so then when I said, hey, let's do a smaller one, he let me do what I wanted, and that was the Corsica S. So now it really had more rocker, and it really had a blunter end. And so the Corsica S was closer to the original boat that I brought over.
And that's really the one that was the groundbreaking
The
boat
Corsica
for
S was a
sure.
game-changing boat. Yeah, it really was a game-changing boat. In America, they had boats like it in Europe. They didn't have the flat hull that the Corsica and the Corsica S had because they were taking full-size 4-meter boats and cutting the ends off, right? And then just kind of finishing it. So they were low in rocker and they sort of paddle like logs. But they were definitely ahead of the curve. No doubt. Europe was ahead of the curve. And it wasn't until the free fall, the Dagger did the free fall, which was like the next game-changing boat, right, with the Dagger free fall. So the Corsica and Corsica S up to that, was really what made river running and creeking accessible and safe in the U.S. and in Europe, because it did very well in Europe too, because it was a better boat than what they had over there, even if it wasn't groundbreaking in its concept.
Then it was the Piranha Creeker was probably the next step after the free fall.
Well, Piranha had the mountain bat, all right, which predates the Corsica. But again, it was loggy.
Yeah,
It was a log, But I had one, and I liked it. I paddled the mountain bat. It was a great boat for what it was. I thought it was better than the Eskimo Gatino or the Letman. I forget what their boat was, and then Prion had some sausage thing as well. I thought the Piranha Mountain Bat was the better of those designs, but they were all cigars. They were round and pointy and torpedo-ish, right? Except the Topolino, the Eskimo Topolino, which was, that thing was way out there, right? No, I don't know if the Piranha Creek. I had a Creek
Microbat.
270.
The microbat, right?
Well,
That
the
was the
microbat was
one.
not. That's play boating. We get into play boating, right? So by
Oh,
the time you get into like 92, 93, all of a sudden the market fractures. Because up to then, you had one boat and you did everything in it. So you had a Corsica S, and you went down the Ocoee and you played in Hellhole in your Corsica S, and then the next day you went and you ran Overflow in the same boat. And around 92, 93, all of a sudden, there's a fracture. And the creek boats got more creaky, and then there was this new tangent where boats got playful. And, you know, and so then you get into, the stunt bat already existed, but then you start getting into the, I forget the exact name of the Piranha boat from the time. You have the Prion Hurricane, came along in 93, followed by the Pirouette SS, the Super Sport, the Dagger Transition. So, you know, these were all influenced by the Hurricane, right? And then the boat that I did, the Scorpion. So you had this new tangent of boats. I don't know really. I think it was a while before there was a new creek boat that was really groundbreaking in the departure. That was as significant as the Corsica S did, and then as the Freefall, right? You had these attempts at it. You had the Y, the Wasteful Y, which made the claim, but I don't think it was. I had the Gravity, which again we sort of made a claim, and we had some interesting rocker. Like we had a rocker brake right under the seats, so instead of having this torpedo rocker where the boats curved up to both ends, it curved down to the seat, and then it was a sharp angle, and it went straight up to the back of the boat. So like all the boats now have, or the new Skippy boats, right? They all have that rocker shape. But I don't know if it was the progression that the free fall was. You know, you could.
yeah, that rocker in the front of the Y was pretty amazing. That was the one thing it did right. Something about that, it just skipped. But
Well, I think it
yeah,
was the flat hull. I don't think it didn't have that much rocker. I think it was more the fact that it had a planing hull. So as soon as it hit, it would skip up. It would plane out, right? Not like modern boats, but for the time, you know. And because it didn't, if you look at a Y now, you'd be surprised how low rocker it was. You know, if you looked at a photo, it's like, ooh, that thing's really pointy and low rocker. Like less than the freefall. The freefall had more going on. But it had a planing hull.
so on the
Yeah.
design side, it's almost like your experience on the Corsica, right? That's almost all of our experience when we're working on a different project, right? We're always having to give up a little bit. You know, we've got this vision, but then they take it, dumb it down, and then the project goes, and we just go on and do another project like that. But it almost feels like that experience to you sets you on a course where you're like, I'm not going to do that ever again. I'm not going to let my vision, right? And you've kind of through Savage, through Riot, through these things, kind of somehow shaped the course, found the money, and created where you could do whatever you wanted, you know, boats like the Fury.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, I paddled for Prion in '93, and the Hurricane was a great boat. Honestly, it was a very good boat. It was groundbreaking. The Piranha Stuntbat was sort of, it came before the Hurricane, but it wasn't quite right. It was very innovative, but it wasn't quite right. The Hurricane, they nailed it. Absolutely nailed it. But by the end of 1993, everybody had copied it. The Super Sport was an improvement on the Hurricane. I don't think the Transition was. I don't think the Transition was an improvement. But then Piranha had the Magic Bat or something instead of the Stunt Bat, something like the Magic Bat, which also was an improvement on the Hurricane. And so I went to Prion and I was like, okay, well, you've got a great boat, but you had a great boat. You got to do a new one because everybody else's boats are better, and by next year you're not going to sell Hurricanes anymore. And they said, no, we've got, you know, the Hurricane's great. And I was like, okay, let me go build a boat. So I went off and I built this boat, the Scorpion, and I went back to Prion and I said, look, you know, I've got this boat, I think you guys should build this thing. And they went, no, 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 no. We're gonna keep going with the Hurricane. And this really good buddy of mine, Pat Miljour, was dating a girl who had a lot of money, and she liked hanging out with kayakers. It was fun for her. We were exciting, and we were young, and we were dangerous, and Pat convinced, her name was Celine Toms, and Pat convinced Celine to invest in this boat and for us to build it. And we started Savage. And that was the first time that I was able to design a boat and there was no compromise. I didn't have to listen to anybody else. I did what I thought was right. And that led to the Gravity, Creek boats, and then the Fury.
Yeah, that Scorpion was definitely not dumbed down in any way, right? And
Oh, it wasn't dumbed down, so it was a handful, but if you got a handle on it, it was the best boat of the class, right? You could do more in the Scorpion, the linking cartwheels for a 10-foot boat, they were all 10 feet, right? So for a 10-foot boat, it was the sliciest, fastest, squirtiest, carviest, cartwheeliest boat on the market in 94. But the floodgates had opened. You know, Scorpion came out at the beginning of 94, and by the end of 94, I was in Fury prototypes.
But
You
yeah,
know?
that boat neither of those two boats ever would have existed coming out of corporations, right? I mean, everybody,
No,
even when the Scorpion came out, it was, three-quarters of the people probably, oh, that's way too edgy, those sharp edges, you could never do that. But like you said, the people that wired it in, it was definitely big improvement on the Hurricane.
yeah, it was. You know, it probably wouldn't have happened without the Hurricane. So you've always got to remember that you know, you're writing the new story on the palimpsest of the past, right? And the Scorpion was influenced heavily by the Hurricane. Um, but I also learned from the Hurricane, and I knew I could make a better boat for what I wanted to do. Now the difference here, though, as well, is the Hurricane you could creek in it. You couldn't really creek in the Scorpion. So the Hurricane was kind of the last generation of boat, arguably the last boat, that would still be a one quiver boat. You had to be a really solid paddler to go creeking in it. No, you had to have your shit together. But if you did, I mean, I was out there with Dan Gavir, and the two of us were running everything in the Hurricane we'd ever run in any kind of a creek boat.
That
So it was
movie, Paddle, right? Paddle Frenzy, or
so
Paddle
frenzy.
Frenzy, really. Was that the South Fork of the Clearwater? You ran
There were a
that
whole bunch
one?
of rivers out west. Yeah, South Fork and Clearwater was one of them, but there
Yeah.
was a whole bunch of stuff we ran, right?
Yeah, that
Um,
was because we really grew up on that movie. I was talking to Olaf Opsommer the other day, and that was their movie too. They had Cavu Day and Paddle Frenzy as well. So it's interesting that one really went both sides.
yeah, yeah. So the Hurricane was the last boat really that did both because the changes that I made to create the Scorpion, the design philosophy differences or changes, made it so much better at what then was called rodeo, so freestyle, but then you lost its creaking river running. I mean, you could river run in it, and I ran a bunch of scary stuff in the Scorpion. Paddle Quest. This is Susitna in Alaska. I'm in a Scorpion. Um, so if it was bigger volume, I was running some really scary stuff in it. Guys were running the North Fork or the Payette in it. But this is all big volume stuff, right? But as soon as it got steepy, creaky, the Hurricane was the better boat, right? So that's why I did the Gravity. The Gravity was my creaking version of the Scorpion because you could no longer do it in one boat. But then the Gravity didn't play like the Hurricane. It was a better creek boat than the Hurricane, but it didn't play like the Hurricane. So I had two boats to do what the Hurricane did by itself, but it did both those things better.
And that is really kind of when that kind of split happened, and you would actually go park and play. I remember the first time we ever even heard that concept, right, was on the lock saw, we talked to you or something, someone in our group, and you're like, oh, I think you're gonna run it tomorrow, and you're like, oh, well, I think we're gonna find a particular wave or particular hole and stay there. You know, the term wasn't park and play didn't even exist, and so we would even say that through the years. Oh, should we find a particular wave or particular hole and just go
Mm.
play there? So, yeah, really, you needed a boat to do both right then, right? And not right before that sort of split, because there wasn't really parking and playing until that moment. And then you said the kind of the floodgates opened, and that led to the Fury, because that was such a departure from everything. What were kind of what really inspired that out of those floodgates?
There were a number of things that led to the Fury. Um, One of them was living in the Southeast. The number of once we started park and playing, once the focus went from running a river and playing where you could to running the river in order to play, and you wanted to maximize the number of play spots, then you start to realize that these 10-foot boats are long. There's not as many spots you can play in because you're just hitting the bottom. They're too long, right? And the features have to be big enough in order to get the ends to go down because they're so long. And even though squirt boating, had been around for ages, and they could get the ends down easily, on flat water with the squirt boats, they were still 10 feet long, right? They were very long. So you still needed to have a deep pool and things like that. And it sort of occurred to me that, hey, I bet if we made a really short boat, we would double or triple the number of places where we can play, because you'd be able to not hit bottom. And so the first Fury prototype was very short. It was 6.5 feet long. Now don't forget, boats were 10 feet. They weren't even 9 feet yet, the production boats. They were still at 10 feet. And I went to 6.5. So it was a huge jump, right? And the idea was, I don't really care how it paddles. I'll float down to the next spot, because the theory was that at 6.5 feet, it's not going to paddle very well. It's going to kind of sucky. And it had a round hole on it, but because it was so short, what I did was I put some edges in the back of the boat to try and stabilize it, so when you were paddling forward, at least it would track a little bit. And I put these little rails from the center of the boat up to the back of the boat, and I flattened the back of the boat out with these little hook rails through the tail. And I wasn't thinking, I was thinking surfing, and if you look at the shape of that original boat, it had like a bit of a surfy shape to the nose to it, and the bow was longer than the tail, because surfing you stand further back, because I was a surfer as well. So you're standing more on the back of the board, and then you got the fins in the water. I didn't want fins, but again, those rails are there to help it turn and things like that, right? And one day we got to a wave. We were somewhere, on a river somewhere, I don't remember where, and I was surfing in this wave. And all of a sudden I did something, and the back broke free, and it did a 180 on this green wave into a back surf, because the back of the boat released. Now I couldn't bring it back around because the front of the boat was all displacement, but I was like, okay, what just happened? And how did that happen? And I went back out in the wave and I tried it again, and it limited success, because I didn't know how to edge, I didn't know which way to lean, so then I went home, and this is all pre-YouTube and all this kind of stuff, right? This is, you had to find videos. And I got my hands on some surfing videos, some boogie boarding videos. And I started watching boogie boarding videos, and these guys are spinning like tops. And then another light bulb went off, and I was like, hang on a second, wave skis. When I was a kid, we used to paddle wave skis, and we had fins in the wave skis, because if you didn't, the boats would just spin like a top. But I thought that had to do with the fact that it was an ocean wave that was pitching, which river waves don't do, right? So it was pitching the boat, and then it would spin in the air. And then I'm like, it's the flat bottom of the boat. So the Fury 2 had a flat bottom. It had slightly rounded rails still, because I'm still thinking like a river runner, right? If you have sharp edges, you're going to get spanked, you're going to get hit. So, it takes a while sometimes to break these old ideas that you have, right? So it still had rounded rails on it. And then I'm like, hang on a second, there's this whole group of people out in California who are paddling these surf kayaks, and they're spinning like tops on these ocean waves. Dick Wold, Merv Lawson, all these guys, right? So I go to California. I go out there and I decide I'm going to go and watch what's going on and go see what's going on. And the tech that goes into the Fury exists. They've already figured this stuff out, right? The flat bottom boat with the planing hull and the hard edges. They didn't have much of a double chine because in an ocean wave, it's not an issue because the wave is so steep that you don't catch your upstream or your upwave edge, right? So they didn't really need these double beveled edges. So then the next prototype on the Fury that I do, I go to a hard edge, but it's a flat hull with a hard edge, vertical sidewalls, like the boats that they had in the ocean, and this thing was a nightmare. There's only a few times in my life where I've been this abused on a river wave. Like, it beat the living bejesus out of me, this boat. Like, scary, like, tiny little waves. Shabam! What? Roll up, bam! Flip over again, roll up, wham! What? And then it occurred to me, I need to lift that edge. I want the edge, but I got to lift it out of the water. It can't be engaged. And that's where I went to the double bevel, right? And then you start thinking back to some of the boogie boards, and some of the boogie boards have got that going on a little bit. And I think one of the Dick Wold boats had a little bit of it, although his idea was that once it was planing, you were on a narrower boat because it would plane up onto the smaller surface, but when you were paddling, it was on the bigger one. So I wasn't really looking for that. I was just trying not to window shade. And then I figured I needed more rocker than the ocean boats, and I was getting big into snowboarding, and snowboarding had discovered side cut. So snowboarding departed from skis. Skis had almost no side cut. They were straight, right? And so were snowboards in the 80s. And then all of a sudden they put side cut on snowboards and they turned better. And I went, let's put that on the boat too. So there's a lot of conflicting ideas that end up in the Fury, right? Which is why it was so odd looking when it finally came out, because there was a lot of conflicting stuff going on. But the paddling world is pre-Fury and post-Fury. There were no more planing hull playboats after the Fury. That was it. It was the end. Every playboat after the Fury had a Fury-style planing hull. Not with side cut, but,
Well, that's amazing. You actually went out and visited Dick Wold, kind of the legendary surf ski shaper there.
Yeah, well, it wasn't specifically Dick. It was just there were some events out on the West Coast that I knew were there, and so I went out to those, right? I went out to these events, but then everybody was going to be there, right? And at the same time, Mark Cassina. So Mark Cassina was working for Necky, and they were working on a ocean surfing boat as well, called the Rip. And the Rip eventually they made changes to the Rip from the original ocean surfing boat to make it something that would work on rivers as well. So they were already working on that boat when I was working on the Fury. We were kind of working in tandem on these things on different ends of the continent with different focuses. I was focused on rivers, they were focused on the ocean, and then we kind of met in the middle, right? And I think the Rip came out a couple of months after the Hammer, which was my second planing hull boat. But they were just slow to market. The concept, they'd had it for a while. They were just slow.
So I guess part of the kicking and screaming of getting the planing hull boat into the whitewater industry was that World Championship where, a green wave spin was this really high score because it was so hard to do with the round bottom boats. And then you came out with the planing hull, and a couple days or something before the World Championship, they realized how easily you could spin green waves and change the score that you'd get.
Yeah, almost. That's almost it. So in '96, we had the production Fury. By the time the pre-worlds came in '96, Daga had the Vertigo, Wavesport had the Stubby, Perception had the Whippet and the Whiplash. So these are all semi-planing, all right, boats, with the exception of the Fury. And they could flat spin when the conditions were perfect, when the wave was perfect to you in the perfect place, and all the stars aligned, you could spin those boats, right? So the spin was there, but it was very difficult to do with a high flush rate, because if you made any mistake, you flushed off the wave. The hole was upstream, the wave was downstream. If you went out onto the wave and tried to score on the wave and you made a mistake, you were off the wave, you have 0 points, you're out. So nobody was focused on doing any wave moves. You went into the hole, you did your hole stuff, and if you blew it and flushed, instead of paddling back up to the hole, you would catch the wave and you would try and do some wave moves in these boats. But it was very, very difficult. And the 180 or 360 flat spin on the green wave was the same score as it was in a hole. But it's easy to spin in a hole, right? You go to the corner and you spin. It was very, very hard in these boats to spin on a wave. And so after the pre-worlds, it was acknowledged that, okay, we need to readdress this point system for how we're going to score wave moves, because the whole scoring is not working. And we were just starting to get like these 45-degree blunts, right? The one end on the wave, on the green wave, in a whole a 45-degree cartwheel or rotendo, whatever you want to call it, was dead easy. The vertical was scoring high, but the low angle ones weren't getting high points. But it was extremely difficult on a green wave to do this with the boats that we had. And so it was agreed at the pre-worlds, at the meeting after the pre-worlds, that we would go away, think about this, propose a scoring system to the organizers, who would then come up with a scoring system, send this out to everybody, right? So we did that. Everybody, all the countries were supposed to send in their propositions. The organizer, Mark Scriver, in Canada for the Ottawa Worlds, then compiled what he believed was the best scoring system and emailed it out to everybody, right? And I saw this and I was like, wow, they took almost all of my suggestions. This is great, fantastic. Now don't forget, this is 1996, right? Early days for email, and the agreed method of communication was email. That's how we agreed that we were going to communicate, right? But most people were not on email, but the idea was at least the country head, whoever was in charge of each country's committee, was going to be on email and communicate via email. So now I'm looking at these rules and I go, okay, well, I could design a boat to go in the hole, a new boat for 97 worlds, or I could design a boat that optimizes the scoring on the wave and take the risk. And at the time, I didn't know how to make a boat do both. So all the things that made the boat really good on a wave made it not good in a hole. It just made it spanky and hard to handle and just catastrophe, right? So I spent all spring developing this boat, all summer practicing wave moves, and I had those things down. I was linking double ends on a green wave. I was doing 720 clean spins on a green wave, shove-its, all these different moves that were really high scoring. And I was like, I think I can win the worlds doing these things on a green wave and never go in the hole. And everybody else is doing the same thing, right? Everybody else is looking at the rules and saying, I want to design a better boat because I want to win the worlds, but they were focused on the hole. So everybody designed a better boat in order to win the worlds. Piranha, Dagger, Wave Sports, and everybody showed up at the 97 Worlds with their take on the ideal boat to win the Worlds. But they were all hole focused. And in the training leading up to the Worlds, everybody realized, oh shit, he's going to win. And then everybody else in the Riot boat, the Glide, are going to be second, third, fourth, fifth, because we can't compete with that. So they had an emergency meeting 2 days before the Worlds and agreed to set the rules back to what they were at the pre-Worlds in 96.
Oh, man.
The way it was phrased was, we're leveling the playing field. You have an unfair advantage. This is not fair. My argument was, you all had the same rules that I had, and you focused on the wrong thing. So then some countries were like, well, no, we never saw these rules. We only saw them when we got here. And I'm like, okay, but that's not the organizer's problem. That's the problem of your country representative not having opened their email once in 8 months. never checking their email. Because, like I said, email was new, right? That's not the problem of the organizers. The fact that your country representative never bothered to open their email one time in 8 months and see this thread and this discussion that had been going on and never participated and never downloaded the rules. Other countries did. Germany, for example, voted against the rule change because they're like, no, we had the rules. We just didn't interpret them the way you did. And same thing with the UK. I think UK voted against the rules change as well. They were like, no, we had them. We just didn't see the potential. But then countries like the USA were like, we never saw the rules. Like 2 weeks before the Worlds is the first time we ever saw them. Like, well, that's not our problem. So there's this contention, and it's still contentious today, right? About whether or not it was fair that the rules had changed at all, even though this is what was agreed with. Whether it was fair that the method of communication was email when it was so early in the email days, and not everybody had email. In fact, very few people had email in '96. But that's basically what happened, right? So, and then I had a vote that sucked in the hole. It's terrible in the hole, and I hadn't played in a hole in 6 months. I'd only been working on hole stuff, on wave stuff,
And how much of it's personal, though, right? Like, had WaveSport had the same boat you had, would they have received the same reception, And maybe it goes back to another campfire story about yourself. I heard about, maybe I heard you tell sometime long ago, but maybe one of the first rodeos you were at in the Southeast, and probably had the Mohawk then, who knows, but later in the evening, one guy came up to you who didn't know you and was like, "Can you believe that Corran Addison? Isn't he a total asshole?" And was saying it right to you.
Okay, so I don't know if we're talking about the same story. In which case, it's in Colorado, and we go into this retail store. I forget which one it was, and there's some video playing. I think it was Cavu Day or Paddle Frenzy or one of those, right? But we were out there doing the rodeo tour and promoting the Scorpion, and but this video is playing, and somebody goes, "Geez, that Corran guy, like he's really good, And the employee in the store goes, "Yeah, but he's a real dick. The guy's a complete asshole. We used to be best friends, and he fucked me." And I'm standing right there, and a couple of people look at me, and I'm like this, And I go, "Really? He did? Oh yeah, we were like best of mates." So now I'm talking to the guy, and he's like telling about how we were the best of mates. Doesn't recognize me, and. I'd stolen some ideas of his, or I'd done something to him. I forget now what it was, but basically he was like he decided for whatever reason, I don't know what it was, that he didn't like me, and so he was inventing this story about why it was that he didn't like me, and he's telling this story in the first person, and he'd probably heard something from somebody and something else from somebody else, and he'd pieced all this together and then made it first person and all into one story, right? And he's telling this story about it. And I'm asking these questions about when this happened and how did it go down, and and he's layering the cake, and he keeps going, and maybe 10 minutes into this thing, I'm like, "Oh, by the way, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Corran." And his face he glazed over, and everybody else around him is howling, and they're laughing, and it really embarrassed him. This guy hates me now. Because it was embarrassing, right? And years later, I would hear the story repeated of this guy basically was saying something to the extent of, if he ever saw me again, he was going to kill me. And, and so there are these stories that would get out like this, and it goes, it's hand in hand, right? With fame, if you like, right? Where people, they love you or they hate you, and not everybody's that way. Not everybody's polarizing. There's athletes out there who are extremely well known and very good, and they're not polarizing. Everybody loves them. I was polarizing. I have an opinion, and I'll tell you what that is. Um, and and so that has a polarizing effect. But then the stories grow, and you know, my experience over the years has been most of the people who have a problem with me have never met me or never even had any interaction with me. It's third person stories they've heard from somebody who said this and who said that, and they dislike me because of someone that they like who's told a story that they think is is no good. And then they then tell the story to somebody else, and they then tell the story to somebody else, and so it goes, right? And then usually when you hear the story, it's like, no. It's the telephone, right? It's the silent telephone that goes around the circle, you know? And it can be some silly stuff. I mean, I remember a guy once, I was in the Eddie at Hellhole. So this is in 1991. So I was in the Eddie at Hellhole practicing for the Ocoee Rodeo. And we wanted to promote the Corsica S. And so Perception had paid for me and this other guy, Paul Broussard, to go and hang out at Hellhole the week before the rodeo and practice and get our rides down. And I'm sitting in this eddy, and these paddlers come down, and I just gone out the hole, and I'd done a couple of moves, and I'd flushed, and I'm sitting in the eddy, and I'm thinking about this stuff. And I'm trying to think about what I'm doing. And the guy goes, oh, hey, how you doing, man? I saw some photo of you or read an article about you, and like, I didn't hear him at all. I'm like concentrating. And somebody else like, hey, Corran. I'm like, yeah? Like, he's talking. I'm like, oh, yeah? And so he repeats himself. I'm like, oh. And then he asked me some questions. Just give me a second, dude. Like, I'm doing something. And I went back to thinking, and then I went out in the wave, and I tried something else again, and I come out of the wave. So I'm working. Like, I'm thinking, right? And I'm working on something specific, and I'm concentrating on something specific, and the guy wanted to have a conversation. And I didn't. And later on, I heard from a friend of mine who was at the takeout. He's like, yeah, that Corran guy thinks he's too good for everybody. Like, I'm trying to strike up a conversation in the eddy with him, and he's not interested, and he blows me off, and he was just too good for me. You know? So this is the story that is out now, right? Is that I don't have time for the everyday person. I'm too good for them. You know? I'm stuck up. And then really what it was I'm concentrating. This is my job. I'm at work. I'm in the middle of doing what I do, and I need to concentrate on what I'm doing. This is how I get better at what I do. And I learned from that, and I learned to be like, I'm in the middle of something right now, but I'll gladly have a conversation with you when I'm done. Which isn't what I did at the time, you know? But it's things like that, right?
Part of all that's just standard South African personality, right? You know, Americans aren't used to just people being so direct. And then when you're trying to push stuff and so inspired, then it's just, yeah, how it is.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah, I mean, definitely the colonies, you know, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, you know, places like that. Definitely a lot more direct than you generally find North Americans to be. You know, Americans more than Canadians, but you know, less than South Africans and Australians and things like that. You know, I think that might be part of it, but I think more fundamentally is. You know, you reach a point when you have a small level of fame. I mean, let's be realistic. You know, famous within paddling means not famous, right? You know, it's a minor celebrity in the tiny little insignificant world of whitewater kayaking. But within that world, you know, it's a micro version of the bigger world, you know. So it's the same thing when some actor is at a restaurant with his family and somebody goes over to try and greet them, and the actor's like, man, I'm with my family. You know, and he just wants peace, right? But the person who went over to talk to him is like, geez, what a dick. You know, he couldn't even take 5 minutes from me, right? So I'm not comparing myself to that at all. You know, kayaking, let's keep it real. But within our tiny little world, it's that same kind of effect, you know. And EJ is a good example of someone who doesn't do that. EJ is a great example of someone who everybody loves. right? He figured out very early how to, no matter how busy he is, no matter how occupied he is, no matter how focused he is on stuff, to where he'll take 15 seconds and greet you and talk to you before going back to his thing. And I think he's a great example of someone who's almost universally loved, you know.
On that bit of notoriety back then, early 90s, that may have spawned some from the Looking Glass, running Looking Glass Falls, and the Batman suit. Another one of those telephone stories that's been told around, but what inspired that?
Um, so the 80s, there was a bad drought, very bad drought in the Southeast in the 80s, from about 86, which is when I arrived in the US, to 89, end of 89, or the winter of 89, 1990. I forget if it was December or January when I ran it. I don't remember. It was the middle of winter. There'd been almost no rain. Nothing had run. The Chattooga was at 6 inches at best. It would be at minus 2, minus 3, minus 4, and then a little bit of rain, and you'd get up to 6 inches, and it was like, hallelujah, 6 inches. Wow, this is awesome. And the only thing that was running was the Ocoee. And every now and then you'd get on something like the Tellico at low water, and so it was very limiting on what the options were. The green hadn't been discovered yet, or hadn't been rediscovered, I should say. It had been, even though sometimes the rivers came up, and we did get to run some stuff. We got to run Whitewater and Toxaway and Linville, and these rivers did come up. We would get to run them, but it wasn't a regular thing. You could go 3 months between running cool rivers, back then, because rain was so sparse. And it had been 3 months, and I'd seen this waterfall, and I was waiting for there to be water in it, and there wasn't water, and there wasn't water, and there wasn't water. And one day I was just like, fuck it, I'm going. And we didn't know. We didn't know what the human body could take. We did know that dropping in at 45 was a bad idea. You would whiplash, right? So you either wanted to pencil in or you wanted to land flat. You could run 20 footers flat all day long, and no big deal, right? Doesn't hurt. And I'd run some 20, 25 footers flat and landing in usually boiling water, and nothing to it. And so I probed around the bottom, and it was like 5 feet deep, and I'm like, well, penciling in is not an option. I'm going to have to land flat. Batman had just come out. I'd just seen Batman with Michael Keaton. It was awesome. And I built this Batman helmet that I'd been wearing on the Ocoee. I had this thing for like 4 months or something on the Ocoee, and I'd been running the Ocoee in this helmet. I think I did the Ocoee rodeo wearing it, and some stuff like that. I just decided one day to go up and run this waterfall. I'm like, I'm going for it. And we went up, and like I said, scouted the pool, and it wasn't an easy takeoff, because in order to boof it, to make sure it was very shallow, there wasn't a lot of water, and there was a specific spot that I had to get exactly right in order to make sure that I planed out dead flat. So it was a perfect run in the sense that technically I did exactly what I intended to do. The lack of judgment is in somehow thinking that boofing a 78-footer is the same as boofing a 25-footer, and that the human body could withstand that kind of impact and those sorts of forces. Now, I'd already run a higher waterfall than that. I'd run a higher one in France, but I penciled in. I ran one in France that was 100 feet, 103, I think it was. But penciled in, right? And it was completely fine. Just bloop, deep, popped out the bottom, no big deal. Slightly stiff-necked the next day, but nothing to it, right? So I was like, I've run 103. This is 78. It's less. And so there's some lack of judgment there, right? So I think some of the critique of having run Looking Glass is the apparent lack of sound judgment. I ended up in hospital for 3 months in traction with broken spine. At the time, the doctors didn't think I would walk again. I had no feeling in my legs because the swelling in my back was pinching the nerve, and I had no feeling in my legs from waist down. So I thought it was all over, right? And it turned out that once the swelling went down a few days later, then feelings started to come back, and they couldn't do any X-rays at first because of the swelling, so they had to wait. And then a few days later, even though they'd immobilized me, and then once they got through the X-rays, they're like, okay, no, you're fine. Your spinal cord's fine, you know. So I think some of the negative reaction towards me was this guy lacks judgment, you know. And on top of doing something stupid like running a 78 footer and boofing it, I'm wearing a Batman costume. Like, who does that, right? So you can kind of see where they're coming from, right? You know, like it's not completely unwarranted.
So you ran a 103 footer in the late 80s? And
Yeah, yeah, 87. 87. Yeah.
so Sean Baker's whole record on Aldair Foss was already way behind.
Well, okay, so Sean Baker's record was an official record with Guinness because he had a policeman or a school teacher or like the required people there to ratify that the waterfall is this high and he did run it. I had none of those things, right? We measured it with a rope. You know, we dropped the rope down, measured the drop, and then afterwards measured it with a tape measure on this rope. It was 103 feet. And initially I had a photographer there, and it was a hydroelectric scheme. And they never turned the water on. And so the photographer left, and I went back to what I was doing. I was in Tignes skiing, so I went back to skiing, and then we were literally leaving Tignes to go back to Belgium where I lived at the time, and it was running. And we pulled over, and I put my gear on, and I ran down, put the boat in the water, and paddled off the waterfall. You know, and there was some tourist there. There was somebody there who was taking pictures of the mountains, and they got this photo of me, and I gave them my address in Belgium, and they mailed me a print. And it's this blurry photo with a finger halfway across the image of this really blurry photo of me right on the lip, kind of like the photo's too high, so I'm at the bottom of the image. And I no longer have the photo, but it was literally a 4x5 print. And that was it. That was what I had from that waterfall run, right? So you can't claim the record because it's not ratified. So Sean's record is a legitimate record because it's a ratified record for what it was. I ran higher, but it wasn't ratified. So it's kind of like when I think it was Ed Lucero that ran 100. I think it's 105 feet. The one that he ran up in the Northwest Territories,
Alexandria.
the Alexandria Falls. Yes, I think it's 105 feet, right? So he broke the record by 2 feet, but again, it wasn't ratified, right? And then Tyler Bratt blew them out of the water with 178 feet. That guy's a legend, man. He went from 105 to 178. Jeez Louise.
He ended all discussion of that debate. So then, after the whole flat spin worlds, right, I was kind of into the glide. Pretty legendary boat. I remember seeing Brad Ludden on Superwave on the Kootenai in a glide, and it was just the most next level thing I've seen. But that really kind of boat, maybe that led to that kind of really iconic era on the Zambezi with people like Steve Fisher, Nico Chasing, Dan Campbell. That was kind of a real special moment in time. It felt like of people just pushing it to the max. How did you guys end up kind of going there and spending time?
Well, you know, it's once you cross the Rubicon, right? So the floodgates open, and now the floodgates are open, and then it becomes a rat race. So you have the Riot Boys all trying to outdo each other and outdo the other guys because you're trying to sell boats, right? So if we have better photos and better video of everybody else of our boats doing better stuff, we're going to sell more boats, right? And you know, sort of like, you know, win on Sunday, sell on Monday, right? So you want to go to the contest and you want to go bigger and do better and do more than the guys can do in their boats. And the other thing as well that we were actually very good at Riot was we understood this new medium for marketing. So prior to, you know, the mid 90s, everything was print related, magazines and stuff, right? And internet was just coming online, but traditionally content in magazines was provided by the magazine. So they would hire a photographer to go with these people to get photographs of this trip and this expedition. And what we were doing was, and video was very popular. Video just started being the thing, right? So everybody's out running all these rivers and everybody's shooting video. And we were shooting video, but we always made sure we were shooting photos. And so we had more content for magazines than everybody else. So we were providing the material for the magazines, whether it was the US, the UK, Germany, wherever you were in the world. We were sending more photographs to more magazines than anybody else. And so it was our products that were being seen, but that only works so long unless there's something new about the image. And so, you know, and we're all trying to outdo each other. So now it's not good enough to just do a cartwheel. You've got to do a cartwheel over a wave wheel. And now that's just not good enough. Now you've got to throw one off of a waterfall, right? And everything's building on itself, right? And then we were also very early on the internet. I mean, Savage, I think, was the first kayak company to have a web page, I think, Savage Designs. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I think. And I remember back in the day, it was AOL, right? So I remember when we signed up for a web page online, at the time, web pages were so few and far between that when you logged on to AOL, it was new web page of the week, and this was global. There was like a new web page a week, and Savage was the new web page that week. And I remember what's interesting about that is we were the last one to be that week, because the next one was new web page of the day. All of a sudden, it was a new web page every day, and that lasted a few months, and then it was a flurry, right? It was a flurry, because this is 94, right? With Savage, right? 94. But anyway, so we were on really early with web, even though we were doing it with Savage and we're online with web. But you know, I was blogging, or you know, back then blogs were a thing, right? And you had to have content. And so it wasn't just the fact that we wanted to develop new moves to win at rodeos and develop new moves to, you know, to outdo each other, but we also needed content to be continuously fresh and new. And, you know, and everybody was trying to do this, of course. It's just, I think we were just the most effective at it at the time.
And so you started doing trips all over to do it. I mean, you had Paul Villacourt getting those unbelievable images. And then were you spending a lot of time down there on the Zambezi?
No, I never spent a lot of time down there. So that's the other thing as well, is even though, you know, I've been a pro paddler since basically the early 90s, I've also been a business owner. And so I don't get to go on as many of these trips or get to paddle as often as everybody else that's on the team, right? But I was very good at making sure that when I did paddle, it was filmed and photographed. And so you would have Steve and Nico and these other guys do, you know, 6 different trips that last 3 weeks each. And I would fly in, be there for 3 days and leave. But have just enough images of me to where it appears like I was there for the 6 weeks also, you know. And I would knock it out in 3 weeks, the photos and video that we needed of me, and then I'd go back to work. I'd fly back and get back to work, right? You know, I continued to win contests because my equipment was better. Even though you've got other guys who are training all the time and they're going from rodeo to rodeo to rodeo, I would fly in on Friday, practice on Friday afternoon, win the rodeo on the weekend and then fly back on Sunday night, but I had better gear. So it allowed me to come in and do well and then leave, you know. So I wasn't actually on as many of those trips as people think, or I was on a lot of them. I was on maybe a third of them or half of them, but I wasn't there for the full duration like you have the impression when you watch the movie or read the article. You know.
How did you kind of hook up with Steve Fisher? Because he really kind of became that perfect person to find for exactly what you're talking about, you know, and getting the photos, building the brand, and just such became such an iconic person. But how did you know him back when he was young in South Africa?
Yeah,
Or?
yeah, I knew him vaguely, not very well. I knew him when he was a kid in South Africa. I mean, I was a kid too. I was in my early 20s and he was in his teens, right? Um, and we'd met briefly when I was down there in 91, 92 training for the Worlds, for the Olympics. And he was somewhere where I was paddling and we bumped into each other a couple of times. But then when we started Riot, Nico Shassing, who had paddled the Hammer prototype and loved it, decided that he was going to bring 3 hammers into Zambia, 1 for him and 2 to sell. And he approached Steve, and Steve was like, nah, he was in the kendo. I was like, nah, I like my kendo. And Nico was like, come with me. And they went out to some wave, and Nico gets on this wave, and he goes, boom, sideways, and slides down this wave sideways, and they pull it back up to the top, and then did a 360 down on the wave. And Steve's on shore, and he's like, yeah, I'll take one. Like this. He's like, yeah. I put my name on one of those boats, for sure. And then, so he was paddling the Hammer, and Nico sent me some footage, and Steve was in the footage, and Nico was in the footage that we then used in Operation Zulu, in the video that we did. But then Steve sent me, I think it was a phone call probably back then. He said, hey, you know, I'd like to come to the U.S. and do some paddling, and I was wondering whether, you know, Nico said that you guys do this tour every year that lasts 3 months, and I was wondering whether I could tag along, if I could be part of that. And I was like, yeah, sure, come on over. No problem, you know. And I didn't really know him that well. I didn't know much about him, and I'd seen a little bit of paddling footage of him, and he was solid enough. You know, he looked, you know, good enough. He hadn't come into his own yet, but he was, you know, he was there, right? And then we did the rodeo tour in 97. Yeah, the spring of 97 when we had the Hammer. And we did the rodeo tour starting in California and working all the way up and way down. And he was great. He was, you know, it was fantastic to paddle with him, and we pushed each other. And Brad Ludden was on that trip as well. So it was Brad Ludden, Steve Fisher, and myself. And we were and my girlfriend, and we were in a 2-seater convertible, the 4 of us. And it had these like micro bucket seats behind the driver and passenger seat in the front that you could kind of squish a person into. And I was pulling this trailer behind this 2-seater convertible sports car. And we did the rodeo tour in this Ford Mercury Capri. It was a Ford Capri. And we did this tour in this thing until we fried the motor on this vehicle, like burst into flames one day, like on the road, just flames coming out of the hood. The thing caught fire, and that was the end of that, that vehicle. So the 2 of them were squished in the back of this car as we went from event to event for 3 months. It was pretty funny.
Nice. Yeah. And then you've kind of really gotten into the SUP pretty early on in those days. How'd you kind of see that? How'd you get excited about the stand-up paddleboard stuff?
I wasn't a super early adopter. Again, it's one of those things to where I'm good at marketing. So when I did get into it, I popularized it. There were people like Charlie Muncie, Dan Gavere. These guys had already been whitewater supping for about a year by the time I cottoned onto that. But they were not really promoting it, or not effectively promoting it, or maybe they were just not doing it quite as well as they could have, or to the wrong people, the wrong media outlets. I'm not really sure. Dan's very good at marketing, as you know. But I got into surfing again. I surfed as a child, but I got into surfing again in about 2002. I really got back into it, and I started surfing on river waves here in Montreal. And I saw SUP for the first time in 2004 in Hawaii when I was out there surfing. But the light bulb didn't really go off. I was just like, that's stupid. Like, I was a shortboarder. It looks like they've taken a longboard and made it even bigger. It doesn't make any sense. And what's with the paddle? Like, I don't get it. I'll just go kayaking in that case, right? So I didn't get it. The light bulb didn't go off. And I think it was in 2005, or maybe the winter 2004, 2005, a good friend of mine, Julian Filion, who at the time was working for Liquid Force and Patagonia as a designer for them. And we would go down to New Hampshire to go surfing. And he decides that he's bringing a paddleboard. And I was just like, oh, jeez. All right, whatever, man. And we go down there, and I'm surfing. I'm on a shortboard surfing. And it was about -7, 8 Celsius outside. So the water's 5 degrees, 6 degrees Celsius, and the air is -7, 8, 9, something like that, right? So the air is a lot colder than the water. I'm in the water. I'm sitting in 5-degree water. He's standing on this paddleboard in -7-degree air, and he freezes. And after 30 minutes of this board, he's like, hey, man, do you want to try this thing? I'm like, no. Not interested. He goes, come on, man. Like, I'm freezing. Like, do you mind if, like, just switch out for a while? Like, I'm really cold and I don't want to go in. Fine. So I get on this thing and I wobble around for about 5 minutes trying to figure out the stability. And then I paddle onto this wave. And I'm paddling back out. I was like, oh. I get back out. He goes, what do you think? I'm like, oh. I take another wave and I had a good ride. And, oh, this is pretty fun. And I paddle back out. He goes, just one more ride and then I can switch back out. Like, it's okay, dude. Go ahead. Warm up. Like, you were cold. You're fine. And I was like, this is really fun. But immediately I was like, this board sucks. Like, it's way too long. It's way too big. It's this big flapping thing. Like, why is it 10.5 feet long and, like, this wide? And it's like, it could be much smaller and higher performance than this. And on the way back, like, in my head, I'm designing this new paddleboard. And I'm shaping this thing up in my shop. And as I'm shaping it up, I'm like, I wonder if you could paddle on river waves on this thing. And so once I got it shaped up, I decided to go out into the Lachine Rapids and paddle down. And it was really hard to paddle down the river. It wasn't designed for that. It was super hot. And I'm like, I bet I could design one that would be easy to paddle. And then that's kind of when I found out that Dan Gavere and Charlie Muncie and a few other people were paddling on rivers on SUPs. And they had these surf shapes. So they were same problem that I was having with these surf shapes that were paddling around on rivers. And I was like, this can be better. And I did the rapid fire that we actually ended up putting in plastic. And it was a game changer. And this is before the inflatables got any good. And it was a game changer as far as making it accessible, making it easy, something that anybody could now, if you had some paddling experience or some river experience, you could get on a paddleboard and it was doable. You could paddle class 2, 3, and it with a reasonably high level of success. And I totally got into it. And for several years, that's all I did. I didn't even kayak anymore. I just paddleboarded whitewater. And it was really fun. It was fun to be a beginner again. It was fun to suck at something, to really suck at it. And, every single time I went out, I got better. And I hadn't got better for a long time paddling. And you could argue, in fact, I was already over the hump. I was already on the downhill slope, where I was already the best I was ever going to be in a boat. And every day I was going to be slightly worse than I had once been. And for paddleboarding, every day I went out, I was going to be slightly better than I was yesterday. That's fun. That's invigorating, right?
Yeah, being on that learning curve is what's so fun on any sport. I've been surfing a lot the last while. And yeah, it's so fun to get better at a sport. When you've done all these other ones so long, it's hard to get there.
Yeah, it's hard to have that feeling, right? That feeling of success where yesterday I couldn't do this and now I can, you know? And in kayaking, the only way I was getting that feeling was running some godly, insanely dangerous rapid where, I didn't run this last time I was here, and now this time I'm going to run it. And it was it's life-threatening every time, and it was really fun to be able to be on this high trajectory and this learning experience and to experience success, the elation of success without the danger that accompanied it. Because especially in the early days when success was class 3, right? A good run through a class 3 rapid was success, where you didn't end up in the water, or you didn't end up on dropping a knee, or you didn't end up wobbling around. It was just a nice clean run with no wobbling and paddle flapping, and you came out the bottom and it looked stylish, So all the success with none of the death. And that was a huge draw for me, back then.
Actually, now that I think about it, maybe that's part of what made that late 90s, early 2000s era in whitewater kayaking so iconic is the entire sport was doing that every year, right? As each new boat came out, every single person jumped up their skill level so much. And then that early rodeo tour, with Dan Gravere, yourself, EJ, that was really that whole group you guys must have felt like was just such crazy momentum of getting better.
It was really fun, and also because it was mostly playboating focused. Again, it was that thing where there was the feeling of success without the danger, right? Because you're not necessarily running hard stuff. I mean, there was a 2-3 year period where almost nobody went creek boating, right? It was just you could barely give away a creek boat, let alone sell one, and it was so focused on freestyle that you had these momentous challenges, these technical challenges, without any real danger, unless you wanted to go throw yourself in some big gnarly hole. And the other thing it wasn't just us, right? So it wasn't just the guys at the top. We had this massive progression and success rate. It was also the average paddler who was following us. Now, they would be a whole year or two behind us, but they got there. So, in 99, your average paddler was doing more than the world's best were doing in 97. Right? Your average paddler could look at the world championships from 97 and be better than that. That's cool.
Well, that's crazy. Yeah, that's so true, though. That the whole sport was evolving so fast.
Mm-hmm. And it was a combination of the equipment was getting so much better. Every 6 months, it was like if you were in a boat that was 6 months old, you had no chance. That was old news. That boat is not going to do the latest stuff. It's old. And, I mean, we're talking 6 months. Boats go years now, before something else comes along, which is normal. Any sport sees that, right? You have this massive technological climb, and then it plateaus, and then it becomes incremental, right? The changes and the developments and things like that, and that's normal. And every now and then there's a bit of a bump where things something happens. We're seeing it now in creek boating, right, with the rocker brake right under the seat and the squish tails. So not half slices, pivotable tails, but not a half slice. Creek boat rocker, creek boat volume, creek boat handling with a pivotable tail, and it's taken the sport to another level, right? It's somewhere where it wasn't just 3 years ago. But it's not a massive. It's not Corsica S or free fall type jump. You know, it's a nice bump. It's a nice bump that we haven't felt for a while in boat design. That we're seeing with that. So, there was this trajectory in the 90s from about 96, 7, somewhere around there, to about 2002, 2003, where it was just this, it was a vertical, the curve was almost vertical. Technologically and equipment-wise, very cool.
Yeah, and the rodeo tour doesn't even exist anymore. So it
No.
was really capturing such a moment in time. Everyone just coalescing around these events. Dan Gavir starting so early, like actually going on tour. Like I think out west, he must have been the first one that was like, I'm gonna go to all of these events.
Probably, yeah, probably. He was definitely the first, I think. Well, definitely the first. You never know. You got to be careful. But he was probably one of the very first on the West Coast. I was one of the first on the East because Prion was paying my way, right? So this was a new thing. Prior to that, you went to a couple of events within several hours drive of where you lived, and what happened with me was that Prion was paying me a monthly salary that I could live off of, plus all of my expenses, airfares and all expenses to go to any event that I wanted to go to, right? They realized the benefit of me going to as many events as possible. So in 93, I went to 15 events, won 13 of them, of the 15 events that I went to, right? Now, a lot of those events only had local talent. Half of them had, some high-end paddlers there, but they weren't all going to all of them. Nobody was going to all of them. So when I went out west and I was in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Dan was at all of those, but he wasn't at the ones in California. Actually, Dan was, but he wasn't the ones on the East Coast, for example. But then you'd have Bob McDonough and Chris Bilius and Shane Benedict, who were they were at the ones on the East Coast, but they weren't at the ones on the West, right? And I was at all of them. The next year, everybody was at all of them. Like, the writing was on the wall, and now all of a sudden you had pro teams for all the companies, and they were fitting the bill. And back then, boats were profitable. Back then, companies actually made money. They made a good profit on whitewater kayaking, and that profit that they were making allowed them to pay for athletes and teams to not only go around to events, and it's not just the fact that the athletes are going to events competing against themselves, but they're going to these events where more than half of the people at the event are your average local paddlers, right? So you'd have 20 pro paddlers at an event, and you would have 30, 40, 50 local paddlers who get to intermingle with these pros that they would usually see on videos and magazines and things like this, right? And that was good for the sport because the manufacturers had the money to do that, and they had the money to support these events. They could give cash prizes, and they could give gear prizes, and they had the money to spend on R&D. So you had a technological revolution every year as opposed to every 5 years, because the retail price that the boats were selling for was at a level, was several times more than what it cost to make them, compared to nowadays, for example, where you're selling them just barely above fabrication cost. So there's no money. Nobody has any money to do these kinds of things that they did. And it's a vicious circle, right? Because they're not doing these things, the boats aren't changing that much. And because they're not changing that much, you're not motivated to buy a new boat because the one you have is perfectly good. And you're not going to any events where you're seeing people doing things that you can't do because there are no events, and so you don't feel the need for a new boat, even if there was one that was technologically better. It's this vicious circle. If boats were selling now, retail-wise, with the same margins that they were selling back in 2000, for example, they'd be $2,800 is what a kayak would sell for. They're $1,500, mine are $1,800. So, nobody can make any money, and so there's other things as well. Like the salaries people made in 2000 relative to the cost of living was higher than what it is today. Cost of living has gone up and salaries haven't followed, right? So there's not as much spare money to spend on a $2,800 boat, right? For a lot of people. You got people buying $15,000 mountain bikes, and a lot of them buying, there's a huge number of people buying $8,000 mountain bikes. Massive, 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 less than the $15,000 mountain bikes. So there is money out there, but they're not buying kayaks for whatever reason. And it's this vicious circle, right? Where there's no money in the industry to create that environment that made kayaking so cool in the late 90s and the early 2000s, that made people want to be part of it, that made the sport exciting, that paid for the events and paid for the people to be there, that, as I said, and that whole era was very unique to our sport. It was a wonderful time if you were part of it, if you were there for it.
Such fierce competition between the teams, right? That, it's only maybe 15, 20 years, but yeah, between Wave Sport, Riot, Dagger, it was everyone putting in money, trying to be better and really supporting all the athletes.
Yeah, Wave Sport had a 20-man team, men and women, 20-person team. The Riot team was never as big, I think we had a little more cream. Not that Wave Sport and Dagger didn't have fantastic paddlers, they did, but we kind of would have our 6-7 best paddlers and then we called it a day, right? Whereas they would have 3-4 superb paddlers and then another 17 good enough, and you could argue either way, that they had a broader base, more people, more boats in the eddy. You would show up at an event and you would have 5 Riot boats, 2 of which would be on the podium, but you had 20 Wave Sports thrown down. That's a lot of people in Wave Sports. They must be good.
Well, they got the X, right? The brand
No,
was...
no, but just irrelevant. Like, assuming that the boats are all just as good as each other, it was more that, maybe our boat was a little bit better, and we had paddlers that were a little bit better, and so we would have a disproportionate number of podiums. But you would go, oh, well, but that's Steve Fisher. Of course he's going to be on the podium, Oh, that's Corran Addison. Of course he's going to be on the podium. That's Brad London. Of course he's on the podium, type thing. But Wave Sport, you might have Jimmy Blakely on the podium, but then the next 8, 9, 10 paddlers are also all in Wave Sports. And you go, wow, that's a lot of paddlers who are really good who are in Wave Sports. That boat must be good. Whereas our attitude was, we don't need as many paddlers. We'd rather have better paddlers and pay them more, type thing. And you could argue either way which method was the better method. They definitely went for quantity. Wave Sport had more pro paddlers than any other team, more than Dagger, more than Piranha, more than Riot. They definitely had the biggest pro team at every event, everywhere where you went. But regardless, you would have, 3, 4, 5 excellent perception paddlers, excellent Dagger paddlers, excellent, Piranha paddlers at every event. It was, what a time. What a time.
Seemed almost inspired some by snowboarding industry because they had kind of that whole team idea and really pushed that, and it felt like that kind of rubbed off on kayaking at that time.
Definitely. Dan Gavir was a pro snowboarder. I was a pro snowboarder. So we were both riding for Nitro actually at the time, Nitro snowboards, and so for me anyway, when I started forming the Savage team, I was heavily influenced by how snowboarding was doing it. And here's an interesting little tidbit for you. One of the innovations that I don't get credit for. At the 93 Reno Outdoor Retailer show in Reno, Savage had a promo video that we were playing in a loop. And it was the first time that a kayak company had a promo video playing in a loop. Dagger had their rolling instructional video, like they'd They had Chris Spilius teaching rolling, and they would play the rolling video, of teaching rolling in the pool. No. The Savage video was a half dozen people doing insane shit to loud, obnoxious music. And it just played in this loop. And it was so innovative that Paddler Magazine, Eugene Buchanan from Paddler Magazine, actually did a blurb about this concept, about this video. Like, it was one of the innovations of the show. Savage had this video with these guys doing insane stuff for like 30 minutes. And this video was just on a loop for 5 days, Following year, everybody had their promo video, type thing, and ever since. But I got the idea from snowboarding. It wasn't my idea. I got it from snowboarding. I was just the first person to do it in kayaking.
Yeah, if only your journey had started making homemade mountain bikes and you'd gone on a similar path, you'd be a wealthy man.
Yeah. There's no money in kayaking, that's for sure. I mean, I did well with Imagine. When I sold Imagine, my paddleboard company, surf and paddleboard company, so I developed some really cool technology, some eco technology, where effectively on a surfboard we managed to cut down the carbon footprint by a cubic meter by using a combination of recycled cores, bamboo fabrics, natural resins. So the way that we were building these boards, and then I sold that company to an investment group for $2 million in California, and that's when I moved to California, right? Because I had to go run the company with them. I've made some money, but then I started a new kayak company and blew through the money, right?
Yeah.
There's an old saying in whitewater kayaking: you know how to make $2 million, or you know how to make $1 million. You start with two.
Yeah, they say the same about the ski industry too. None of them are easy.
Yeah, well, ski does okay. Snowboarding does okay. Like my snowboarding brand makes good money. It's profitable. It's more profitable than less dollars, but it's more profitable. Retail price to cost.
And you've gone right into innovating there too, right? What do you have something going with the bindings or step-in bindings, or what have you been doing on snowboard?
Oh, I've got lots of stuff going. Lots of forks in the fire. So I have it wasn't a step-in, it was a quick step. What do I call a quick step binding? Which was it was still a strap binding, but it was much faster than conventional strap bindings. I'm working on an actual step-in binding now that will work with any boot, so you don't have to have like the step-on from Burton or the clicker from K2. You've got to have their boot. Nidecker has a Supermatic which will use any boot. So it's more like that, but very different in the way I've done it. I have a split board binding that's very new and innovative. That is just hitting the market now. The split board binding that I've got. And then lots of really cool stuff with the shapes. This very surfy, surf-inspired snowboard shapes. I wanted to surf the mountain the way I surf in an ocean on a snowboard. And so all of my shapes are very focused on, with the exception of one of my kids' shapes, which is an asymmetrical twin. All the other boards are very, very surf-inspired. So it's fun. I love it. And it breaks up the kayaking. If it was just kayaking still, after 40 years, it might be a little tedious. And so it's fun when I get into winter and I get to work on all the winter snowboardy stuff. And then as I start to approach spring, I'm just gnawing at the bit to do some kayaky things.
So you're designing all the stuff in SolidWorks and things like that?
Yeah, it's all CAD. Depends on what I'm doing. It's all different stuff, depends on what I'm doing. And I work with other people too, it's a lot of work, right? And in one sense, I'm a one-man show, and then I farm out a lot of stuff. So I'll do your basic CAD file, I'll do your basic thing, I get my shape where I want it to be, and then I'll pass it on to somebody, but okay, clean this thing up, make it nice, there'll be little bumps and things, and like the grab loop isn't quite set properly in it, and I'm like, clean this stuff up, make it nice for me, so that it can go to Mold Maker, right? Because that's a lot of work. That's not inventing and innovating, right? It's just tediously cleaning the stuff up once the innovation stuff's being completed, right? And it's the same thing with manufacturing. Like I'm not personally making this stuff. I employ people to do that. Various factories or organizations. I have sales reps. I do some of the sales, but I have sales reps who do the sales. But yeah, so all the very intricate, fine-tuned CAD work, I farm that out to a few people once I've got my basic CAD done.
And so you're living right by the Lachines these days, I think. And what's kind of that scene like? Is that lots of people out playing on the waves on all kinds of different crafts?
Um, More and more. So when I moved back here from California in 2015, I could go out to the Lachine Rapids 4, 5 times in the week for 2 weeks and never see another soul, not one person. And you compare that to what the Lachines was like in 2004, when on a Tuesday morning at 6:45 there'd be 30 people in the eddy, and it would be like that all day long, and it would be 2 hours between rides, and people from all over the world. It was a destination for everybody from all over the world, right? And so it was dead. Yeah. And so this is as a result of the crash in 2008 that then, there's all sorts of reasons why kayaking crashed, why water kayaking crashed, and it's slowly been building up. But now, most days, I'll go out there maybe 5 times a week, and almost invariably, there'll be at least 1 or 2 paddlers out there. Sometimes 7, 8, sometimes nobody. But more often than not, there's a handful of people out there on the wave, particularly if it's after work hours in summertime. There'll be people out there, and the growing community again, and it's nice. It's nice to see people out there again. At one point, Lachines was the only wave of its kind that people knew of, but now there's lots of good waves around that, so it's less of a destination. You've got the Glenwood wave, you've got the one in Columbus, Georgia, and then other waves have been discovered, and so it's less needed to travel here in order to get that quality of wave, because there are other places that now have them. So it's less of a destination than it once was. But I live here.
River surfers hitting it much?
Yeah. There's a lot of river surfers out there. Yeah, I would say more than half of the people that we will see at the wave will be surfers now. Yeah, but it's hard work on a surfboard. It's not an easy thing to do the loop. It's you've got to be dedicated, and it's a lot of work. It's kind of the surfing equivalent of ski touring. You got to earn them. You got to earn those turns.
It's been since they built the wave in Salida about 2 years ago, Mike Harvey and them. It's been unbelievable for the river surfing scene out west. Kind of been the first one really built specifically for board surfing. But over the last 2 summers, it's where I've been, right? We've been river surfing for 25 years. Right? On lunch counter in high school, we would try it out. But that was last year when they first built that was the first time I was like, wow, this is a sport. River surfing this is a thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's upwards of 4,000 river surfers in the Montreal area.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot of people.
And they're out there. There's a few different waves to
There's a
surf
few
around
different
there.
waves. Most of them are not in the Lachines. There's a handful. There's 15 people who go to the Lachines. It's far too scary and it's far too much work. There's smaller waves that are close to shore, that are fun, they're soft, they're enjoyable, they're safe. It's a bit of a beach scene. You're right there looking at it from shore. So they've got hammocks and barbecues and yoga mats, and it's a full-on salt life, except you're in the grass.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been the biggest change. And it seems like these days on river, having fun in the river, it's just pretty easy to get into the river surfing. Doesn't take much gear, not nearly as scary as kayaking.
Sure. Yeah. That's it.
So what's next for you? You gonna keep working on Soul for the snowboarding and the kayaks?
Yeah. You know, somebody asked me once why I called the company Soul. And, because I had Savage, I had Riot, and then I had Corran Sup. Well, I had Imagine and then Corran Sup, right? And then I sold Corran Sup to Riot. And I'm sort of bored and sitting around, and somebody says to me, well, what are you going to do now? You've already sold your name. And I said, well, the only thing I have left to sell is my soul. And so that's how I came up with the name, right? But I don't want to sell my soul. I love what I do. I don't want to do anything else. I don't want to rebuild again from scratch. And so the new challenge with soul is not to build it up into something that is desirable by somebody else, but to build it up into something that is sustainable for me, that remains desirable for me, which is why I do the snowboards, and why I don't just do the boards, but I also work on things like the bindings and things like that. That's why in the kayaking I've done the paddle line, and I do things like the life jackets as well, and the spray skirts and some things in there. Most of that for kids, right? It's all innovative towards kids, and that's also a big part of it with my 10-year-old. He keeps me young. I'm paddling with him. I'm mountain biking with him. I'm snowboarding with him. We surf together, and developing equipment that I don't get to use is a new challenge that I don't get to test. I can't test the boat, right? So it's my best educated guess of what a 3-year-old needs a whitewater kayak to be. Making a prototype and then getting 3-year-olds who don't kayak to get in it, and then trying to figure out, how do you teach a 3-year-old to kayak? What is it that's going to appeal to them? What is it that's going to make them want to do it? What is it that's going to make them want to not get out of the boat after 15 minutes? What is it that's not going to spook them? What's going to entice them? And then it's a whole different set of things for a 6-year-old. So that's a whole different boat with a whole different set of criteria. It's not just, they've outgrown that boat, they need to have a bigger one. No, what's drawing them to the sport at 6 is very different from what was drawing them to the sport at 3. Where they're not really drawn to the sport, as parents putting them in the boat, right? But what's going to spook them at 3, and what's going to give them confidence at 3, and make them feel safe, and make them feel success, is very different from what a 6-year-old is going to feel like success is, and what is his concerns or her concerns are going to be, and what's going to spook them. And that's going to be very different from a 9-year-old. So each time you go up, whether it's a snowboard, whether it's a kayak, it's a completely new challenge every time of, just because I got some things right and some things wrong with the boat that I did for 3-year-olds, it doesn't apply almost at all. Every time it's starting from scratch, of understanding what is going to make them experience success and love for what they're doing. And that's exciting for me. That's really exciting. And it's why I've got such a wide range of products for kids, right? And some of it's live and learn. Like I spooked my kid a couple of times where I would do something. I had some people make skirts for the first boats, and then he flipped over one day, and he was able to pop it off on land, but then he flipped over and he couldn't get it off underwater, and it spooked him badly. And I'm like, okay, the skirt has to come off on its own. Like, it needs to be dry when it's on, but it has to come off on its own. So how do I do that? How do I stop the introduction of a skirt to 9-year-olds where they've never had a skirt, and all of a sudden you put a skirt on them and they're like, whoa, what is this thing that you just put on this is scary. Whereas if they've always had a skirt since they were 2 years old, they've always had a skirt on the boat, they know nothing else. And if that skirt was never scary, then it's not a problem. Now you don't have the problem of 8, 9-year-olds being spooked out by the introduction of this new piece of gear that they never had before. 2-year-olds are paddling in the spa. They don't need a helmet. They're in the spa, they're in the pool, but I put a helmet on them anyway so that they get used to wearing all the same gear. So you don't suddenly show up one day and go, it's time to start wearing a helmet because you could smack your head. do you mean I could smack my head? I don't want to smack my head. Whereas they've always worn a helmet, right? So you just, oh, we wear helmets. It's safe. We always wear helmets. Even when you were in the pool, you wore. Even when you were in the spa, when I had you in the spa in the little boat, and I was rocking you up and down in the spa, you know, at 104-degree water temp, you know, nice and warm and splashy, and you know, you had a helmet on. You know, so it's these challenges and these things that you really have to think, and then trying to communicate with other people who are teaching kids and getting feedback from them, and so that's a really huge part of what keeps it exciting. And then it's the same thing in snowboarding, right? It's the same challenges, and they feed off each other. You learn something from the one that you apply to the other.
Sure seems like you found really good balance. You know, it's funny in life how we're always chasing these high highs. We're so driven, you know, and you have the inevitable setbacks that seem crushing, but you're so driven, and then eventually it all just has to balance out, right? At
Mm-hmm.
level, almost like that. Life's almost like that yin yang symbol, right? Where you
Mm-hmm.
can never quite beat that symbol, no matter what you do. But seems like a beautiful balance you have right now for all of your outlets of your energy and your passions, as well as family and entrepreneurial spirit. It's great to
And it's
see.
crazy, you know, paddling with kids and snowboarding with kids. I mean, you know, I was, like I said, I was a snowboard athlete. I was a kayak athlete, and I run crazy rivers all over the world with amazing people and first ascents and records and championships, and you know, I've done all of it, and nothing beats paddling with my son. None of it. None of it comes close. And same thing for snowboarding. All the different things that I've done snowboarding, none of it compares to riding with my son. And it's so amazing to be in my twilight years, you know, as an athlete, to be experiencing more joy in doing the sports that I love than I have ever experienced before, despite the fact that I'm a long way from being the paddler that I once was and the snowboarder that I once was. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And any father's going to tell you the same thing. Well, parent, any mother, father, whatever, they're going to tell you a similar story. You know.
I had a similar epiphany though when I was doing all the production stuff in China, you know, the helmets and things. And then I was in Silicon Valley working on this kind of like it was going to be the Gore-Tex of the helmets, right? Kind of like a MIPS, but more advanced. And you know, I was in an incubator in Silicon Valley and putting together all this team and money. And then my kids were maybe 5, 3, and 1 or something. And I had been spending a lot of time right away in Asia. And I was like, wait a second. No matter how much money I bring in, no matter what people I can get on this team, I can't make anything even remotely as amazing as these kids that I already have. I need to go all in on them for the rest of this time.
Mm-hmm. And you know, one of the best pieces of advice that somebody gave me on, well, two things advice. One is the days are long, but the years are short. And that hit me. It was like, you know, every day feels like, yeah, okay, I worked late today. It's okay, there's tomorrow. But all of a sudden, 4 years have gone by, and your 1 year old is now 5. And then all of a sudden, your 5-year-old is 10. And you realize that soon they're going to be 15 and they're not going to want to hang out with you anymore. You know? And so you suddenly realize what's important. You know, the other one is time. You can't get it back. Nobody ever lay on their deathbed and said, God, I wish I'd invented one more thing.
Yeah.
You know? I worked one more hour. I got one more raise. You know, nobody, ever. It's, I could start a new project that's going to take an extra 5 hours a week for the next 30 weeks, or I could go play Uno with my kid. Take the Uno.
Savoring that time. That's the really kind of what hit me when similar to that days are short or years are short. I had somehow thought this savor that time, and I've had that kind of. I'm just really gonna, when I'm with my kids, just savor that, even if it's playing Uno, right?
Yeah. Even if it's just hanging, you know what? Sometimes it's just we'll be on the couch and I'll be watching some show and he's watching some YouTube thing on his phone, but we're sitting next to each other and he'll have his hand on my leg and he'll be just rubbing my leg. And we're both doing our own thing, but he's there. And I'm with him. And it'll be time to put him to bed and he'll go, "Oh, Dad, I really enjoyed my evening with you today." And I watched TV and he was on his phone. But he remembers that we were there together. You know?
Yeah.
And I could have been in my
Right.
office working on some new design. And he's in his room on his phone. But instead we were sitting next to each other. You know? And you find that. It's also why I became a father late in life. As a kid, I wouldn't have been a very good dad. I was far too self-involved. I would have been far too into myself and doing my thing my way. And it would have been a drag to have this kid that I assume maybe I would have changed immediately as soon as he popped out and been like, "Wah!" You know. But I don't think I would have been the dad that I am if I'd been a young parent. You know, I got done all that I needed to get done. I got my records, I got my worlds, I got my Olympics, I got my expeditions, I got my inventions. You know, now I'm happy to, you know, cruise along, do some cool stuff, come up with some cool ideas. I still get excited. You know, I'm working on this new binding design that I wake up in the middle of the night and I start sketching because I'm super excited by the idea that this could work. But, you know, it's not the driving force in my life anymore, you know. And you find that balance later, you know.
It's real good to hear you have that outlet for it. Sounds like the perfect outlet for that energy.
Yeah. And
Well,
now he's old enough, my son's old enough to where he'll be like, "Daddy, I had an idea." So he's starting to think like that. "I had an idea yesterday." And he'll start laying out his idea for something, right? And I'm like, "Okay, well, you're going to run into a problem there, so that's got to be problem solved. But don't let that deter you. Like, fundamentally, it's a good idea. So let's take the parts that we know work, and now let's try and figure out the parts that are going to be problematic. And never be afraid to throw out an idea. Like, never be afraid to be like, okay, I've kind of played this one out, and it's no good. Toss it and start again, you know? But he's already starting to think like this, and now I get to have that same exciting development, thought, brain process, you know, with my son. That's really fun.
yeah, for sure.
You
And
know?
then now it's kind of like, how do I get more time on this planet, right? Like this, I feel like our time on Earth is our time in heaven, right? I can't imagine a place more heavenly than this, even though it kind of has that balance. But man, I just wish I could extend it.
But would you feel the urgency that you feel to do the things that we do if it was eternal? Like if you live 500 years, there would be no urgency to doing the things that we do. You
True.
know, the fact that he's only going to be a kid for 15 years. There's a certain urgency to doing the kid stuff with him because I can't do it later. I have to do it now. And there's a certain urgency to doing the things that you want to do because I'm not going to be able to do them later. I'll do other things later, but I'm not going to be throwing myself off of cliffs on a snowboard in 10 years' time, most likely. I'm already at that age where when I land hard and I break. So there's a certain urgency to doing that now that you wouldn't have if it was eternal.
That's a good point of that urgency. I feel like it's from when your kid gets into kindergarten until they're 15, like you said, and they don't want to hang out. That's like this Goldilocks period of that you only get once.
And yet, well, unless you got more than one kid. I got one, right? So I get it once. It's something that occurred to me. It's like a second kid, now, I mean, Kayakings is 10, a second kid now, I've just extended that. But on the other hand, I'm going to be 10 years older. How much of the stuff that I did with Kayakings would I be able to do? Probably most of it, but maybe, But then again, the kid's 5, Kayakings is 15. He's also taken over some, kayaks should be good enough to take him snowboarding and kayaking and stuff that I can't. Or if I can't lift all the gear, I'm a little bit rickety and I can't lift all my shit and all his shit. Well, I've got a 15-year-old who can do that. But so things like that occur to you, where it's like, that's kind of how I would extend life. Would be another kid, but on the other hand, it detracts from the focus that I have now with the son that I have. There's no perfect way, right?
So you guys are gonna get a bunch of skiing in this winter?
I've got more than 20 days in so far.
Nice.
A lot of touring, so mostly touring days. Half of them are touring days, and then some resort days as well. I've really got into touring in a big way recently, and I'm really into that right now. Just doing lift runs, like lift laps. It's kind of lost its luster a little bit, and I go through phases, but a couple of years ago, I'd spend all day at the ski area regardless of the conditions, and now it's kind of like if it's mediocre after a couple of hours, I'm like, I'm done. And then I'm like, all right, maybe I'll go walk up a mountain, go find somewhere.
Yeah, backcountry is so special. You know what? I've been surprised to see what's gotten so popular is skinning at the ski resort. Like now that's a big thing, in the mornings and after they close, like probably more people doing that around here than out in the backcountry.
Well, it's safe. It's a controlled environment. It's
Yeah.
safe. You're not going to get avalanched, right? It's more of a social event. So backcountry, it's a little bit more of an expedition. You're more exposed. You've got to be better equipped. It's not just about having the skins and stuff. You got to have all the gear as well, and you've got to learn some things. You've got to take weather into consideration. None of these things have to be done at a ski area. And it's exercise. It's kind of the same people who do trail running in summer. It's the trail runners who are the inbounds touring crowd. And I've done a fair amount of inbounds, especially in the early days when I was working on techniques, where you've got 300 vertical meters to ascend, and I'm coming down the trail, and it wasn't about the ride down. I'm working on my skills going up. I'm working on my changeover. I'm working on being efficient at the bottom and the top of the mountain. I'm doing it in cold weather, trying to figure out what's making my hands cold, what's not making my hands cold. How much do I need to put on when I get to the top? Can I just keep the stuff on that I'm wearing? Or does the first thing I have to do be to pull out a puffy and put that on before I start doing anything else? So that I don't run into that at the top of some mountain when it's minus 20 out. And I'm efficient with my changeovers. Because it's taking me a minute and a half, not 5.5 minutes, to do the changeover. And in 5.5 minutes, when it's minus 20, howling winds, and you've got an effective temperature of minus 35, you got problems. So I was doing a lot in the early days in bounds, and it was cool for that. But now I do much less. Now I tend to drive away from the ski area and go do it somewhere else.
Oh, well, thanks so much for your time, Corran. That was a real pleasure. That was wonderful to go through all that iconic history of whitewater kayaking. Even any of the young kids, if they want to really know how it all came about, you just summed up a lot of it right there. So where can people find out more about Seoul, the winter and summer stuff? What's the best place to go?
Soulwaterman.com for the kayaks and Soul Stick for the snowboards. You can find both from either website. There's a route to the summer and the winter stuff. And then I have my YouTube channel under my name, Corran Addison, and same thing with Instagram and Facebook. I've seen TikTok. I'm not on TikTok, so I'm too old for TikTok. Snapchat and TikTok.
Dialects will be on it.
He probably already is. So, I don't know what he's on. It's like when I have problems with my computer, I'm like, "Hey, Alex, come help me." He's already like, "No, Daddy, that's not how you do it."
Yeah, mine taught me the voice into the phone. I hadn't been using that hardly ever, like texting, and they're like, why don't you just talk into it? There you go.
Yeah. So. Anyway, it's a real pleasure talking to you. And
likewise.
I look forward to us talking again sometime in the future.
For sure. You have a great winter.
I
Hopefully it
sure will.
snows a lot for you.
Yeah, me too.
All
All right.
right, take
I'll
care,
see you,
Corey.
man. Bye.